The dust swirled with a malevolent persistence, clinging to Jedediah Croft's worn denims, etching new lines around his already weathered eyes. It had been a constant companion since Martha died, a gritty shroud over a world that had lost its color, its warmth. His farm, nestled in the unyielding hollow between two disinterested mesas, was a testament to failing hope, the soil as parched and exhausted as his spirit. Each sunrise brought not promise but the aching reminder of emptiness, a silence in the small cabin where her laughter used to echo. He'd come to the Blackwood Creek mining camp not for solace, for there was none to be found in such a place, but for a length of stout rope, the kind his own frayed tether couldn't match, the kind needed to haul a stubborn well bucket or, perhaps, bear a heavier, unspoken burden. The camp itself was a scar upon the land, a chaotic sprawl of raw timber shacks and mud-choked thoroughfares, populated by men whose faces were maps of desperation and coarse appetites. A pall of smoke from the crude or smelter hung low, mingling with the scent of stale whiskey, sweat, and something akin to despair. He'd intended to trade a few scrawny chickens, their clucking a miserable sound in the crate tied to his mule, find his rope, and retreat to the familiar quiet of his own misery. But the sound of a sharp crack, like a whip, followed by a child's stifled cry, snagged him, held him fast. He saw her then, a girl no older than 12 summers, if that. Her frame was brittle, lost in a dress made of sacking, her hair a matted tangle the color of dust itself. She was attempting to drag a heavy ore cart, its wheels mired in the glutinous mud, while a bull-necked man with eyes like chips of obsidian, Silas Blackwood, the camp's namesake and overlord, stood over her, a thick leather strap in his hand. Another crack, and the girl flinched, a small, animalistic sound escaping her lips, but she did not fall. She just pulled harder, her small body a study in agonizing effort. Jedediah felt something cold clench in his gut, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he'd found Martha still and silent in their bed. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound, weary recognition of cruelty, stark and unadorned. He watched, frozen, as Silas berated her, his voice a gravelly roar that promised more pain. The other miners, those few not swallowed by the earth or the bottle, averted their gaze, their silence a grim complicity. Jedediah's chickens were forgotten. The rope was forgotten. He found himself moving, his boots heavy in the mud, toward Silas. "That child," Jedediah said, his voice raspier than usual, unused to assertion. "She's too small for that work." Silas turned, a sneer twisting his lips. He was a big man radiating a brutish confidence. "She eats, she works. Same as everyone. Got a problem, old man?" Jedediah's gaze was fixed on the girl, who had paused, her chest heaving, eyes wide and terrified, fixed on the ground. He saw the raw welts on her thin arms, the hopeless slump of her shoulders. He thought of Martha, how she'd always wanted a child, how the silence in their cabin had grown with each passing, barren year. This wasn't compassion as he'd known it, soft and gentle. This was something harder, a raw, instinctive need to shield, to intervene, born from the desolate landscape of his own heart. "What'll you take for her?" The words were out before he'd fully formed the thought, blunt and stark. Silas's eyebrows shot up, the sneer deepening into a predatory grin. "Buying, are you? Didn't take you for a man with such appetites." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near Jedediah's boot. Jedediah didn't flinch. His face remained impassive, though inside, a slow burn started. He wasn't buying a possession. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he couldn't walk away. "She's no use to you like this. Half-starved. Beat. She'll break soon." He kept his voice low, steady. "Name your price." Silas eyed him, then the girl, a calculating gleam in his eyes. He saw Jedediah's worn clothes, the tired mule. "She ain't much, but she's mine. Cost me to feed her, little as that is." He named a sum, an exorbitant amount for a child, a sum that would cripple Jedediah, take nearly everything he had left from the sale of half his land after Martha's passing. Jedediah didn't haggle. He reached into his coat, his fingers fumbling with the worn leather pouch where he kept his meager savings. He counted out the bills, the coins, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. The act felt profane, a bargaining for human flesh, yet the alternative, leaving her to this slow, brutal destruction, was unthinkable. Silas snatched the money, counted it with a greedy satisfaction. "She's yours then, farmer. Don't expect no refund if she croaks on you." He shoved the girl forward with a contemptuous push. "Go on, whelp. Got yourself a new master." The girl stumbled, catching herself, but she didn't look up. Her face remained hidden by the curtain of her hair. Jedediah merely nodded, his jaw tight. He untied the chickens, their squawking protests ignored, and offered them to Silas. "For her supper." "What you owed her," Silas grunted, taking the crate. He didn't understand the gesture, or didn't care to. Jedediah turned to the girl. "Come," he said, his voice softer now, though still gruff. She flinched at the sound but didn't move. He waited. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He nudged his mule forward a step. "Come," he repeated, not unkindly. Slowly, hesitantly, like a spooked deer, she took a step, then another, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud. She followed him away from the noise and brutality of the camp, a small, silent shadow trailing behind his equally silent form. The journey back to his farm was a long, bleak passage. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the vast, empty loneliness of the plains. The girl, Ilara, though he didn't know her name then, walked behind the mule, never looking at him, never making a sound. He offered her a piece of dried jerky he'd saved, but she only stared at it, her eyes hollow, before shaking her head almost imperceptibly. He didn't press. He understood fear, if not this particular brand of it. He remembered the fear in Martha's eyes when the coughing sickness took hold. This girl's fear was different, older, etched into her very bones by a life he could only begin to imagine. He tried to speak once, to tell her she was safe, but the words caught in his throat, sounding hollow even to his own ears. What was safety? His farm was a hard place, unforgiving. He was a broken man. What could he truly offer her? The thought gnawed at him as the mesas loomed larger, their shadows lengthening like accusing fingers. He had acted, but the consequence of that act was a small, silent, terrified child, and a future more uncertain than ever. The sun bled crimson across the horizon as they finally reached the rutted track leading to his cabin, the light doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep within him. He had taken her from one hell, but what kind of sanctuary had he brought her to? The cabin, when they reached it, was small, 2 rooms built of rough-hewn timber chinked with dried mud, hunkered low against the wind. To Jedediah, it was a shell, echoing with absence. To the girl, Ilara, her eyes darting, taking in the sagging porch, the single, uncurtained window that glowed faintly with the last light, it must have seemed just another cage, perhaps cleaner than Silas Blackwood's shacks, but a cage nonetheless. He led the mule to the lean-to shed that served as a barn, its own structure groaning under the persistent complaint of the prairie wind. Ilara hovered near the cabin door, a small, frozen figure, her arms wrapped around herself as if to ward off not just the cold, but the very air of this new, strange place. Jedediah unsaddled the mule, his movements methodical, slow. He was tired, a bone-deep weariness that had little to do with the day's journey and everything to do with the weight of his choices. He poured a meager portion of oats for the animal, his own stomach growling in protest. Inside, the cabin was dim, the air thick with the scent of old wood smoke and disuse. Martha's touch, once everywhere, had faded, leaving behind a stark functionality that bordered on desolation. A rough table and 2 chairs, a stone hearth cold and black, a narrow cot in one corner, and in the other, the larger bed they had shared, now covered with a faded quilt, a silent monument to what was lost. He gestured for Ilara to enter. She hesitated, 1 foot barely crossing the threshold, her gaze sweeping the interior with a hunted animal's alertness. He didn't push, just moved to the hearth, laying kindling, striking a precious match. The flame caught, weak at first, then growing, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough walls, making the small space seem both more alive and more menacing. He found a half loaf of stale bread and a piece of dried cheese. He set them on the table, then ladled water from the bucket into a tin cup. "Eat," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her, sensing her fear was a fragile thing, easily shattered by direct attention. He sat on one of the chairs, his back to her, pretending to busy himself with a loose buckle on his bag. He heard the faintest rustle of movement behind him. Minutes passed, measured by the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind outside. When he finally risked a glance, the bread and cheese were gone. The cup was empty. She stood by the door again, as if ready to bolt. He pointed to the cot. "That's yours." It was where he'd slept since Martha's passing, unable to bear the emptiness of their bed. Tonight, he'd take the floor by the fire. Ilara looked at the cot, then at him, her eyes wide and unreadable in the dim light. Suspicion warred with exhaustion on her small face. He saw the faint, dark bruise blooming on her cheekbone, the thinness of her wrists. She didn't move. Jedediah sighed, a quiet exhalation of breath. He unrolled his bedroll near the hearth, the rough wool a familiar comfort. He didn't speak again, didn't look her way. He lay down, facing the fire, the weight of the day pressing him into the hard floorboards. He left the single tallow candle burning on the table, a small beacon against the encroaching darkness. Sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed the scene at the camp, Silas's sneer, the girl's terror, the feel of the money leaving his hand. He was a farmer, not a rescuer, not a father. What had possessed him? He thought of Martha's gentle hands, her quiet strength. She would have known what to do, what to say. He only knew silence and hardship. Eventually, the rhythmic breathing from the cot told him Ilara had succumbed to sleep, or perhaps just a wary stillness. He rose quietly, adding a small log to the fire, the embers glowing like watchful eyes in the darkness. He looked at her then, a small, huddled shape under the thin blanket he'd given her. Her face, in sleep, was less guarded, revealing a child's vulnerability. The harsh lines of fear softened, but not erased. The moonlight, filtering through the grimy windowpane, cast a pale sheen on her tangled hair. He felt a pang, a hollow ache in his chest that was both old and new. He had saved her, perhaps. But saved her for what? The days that followed fell into a strained, silent rhythm. Jedediah rose before dawn, tending to the mule, the few remaining chickens, the stubborn patch of earth he tried to coax into yielding sustenance. Ilara would already be awake, perched on the edge of her cot, watching him with those wide, unblinking eyes. She never spoke. Not a word. When he left to work in the fields, she would remain in the cabin, or sometimes, he would glimpse her standing in the doorway, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. He left food for her, simple fare, cornmeal mush, sometimes a piece of dried meat if he'd been lucky hunting. It was always gone when he returned, but he never saw her eat. She was like a phantom, barely disturbing the air around her. Her fear was a palpable thing, a constant presence in the small cabin. If he moved too quickly, or if his voice was unintentionally sharp, she would flinch, her body tensing, ready for a blow that never came. He learned to move slower, to speak less, though he was already a man of few words. He found himself observing her, the way she held herself, the subtle shifts in her expression that hinted at the turmoil within. He noticed she would tidy the cabin in small, almost invisible ways. A cup washed and put away, the hearth swept clean with a makeshift broom of twigs she must have fashioned herself. She did these things when she thought he wasn't looking, her movements quick, efficient, born of long habit, or perhaps fear of idleness. He didn't acknowledge these small acts, unsure if praise would frighten her or if ignoring them was a cruelty in itself. He remembered the children in the settlement where he'd grown up, their easy laughter, their boisterous games. Ilara was a world away from them, a child old before her time, her spirit seemingly crushed. Yet, sometimes, he saw a spark in her eyes, a flicker of something resilient when she watched a hawk circle overhead, or when a prairie dog darted into its burrow. It was a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. The farm itself offered little comfort. The well was running low, the soil was thin and rocky. The blight that had taken half his corn crop last season threatened again. He worked until his muscles screamed, until sweat blinded him, trying to wrestle a living from the unforgiving land, the effort a distraction from the desolation within him and the silent, watchful presence of the child he'd brought into it. He often found himself wondering about her past, about the horrors that had stolen her voice and her childhood. Silas Blackwood's face would flash in his mind, and a cold, hard anger would settle in his gut. He had acted on impulse, but now, the responsibility for this fragile life weighed heavily on him. He was adrift, and he had pulled another soul into his rudderless boat. The silence between them was a vast, uncharted territory, full of unspoken fears and uncertainties. He knew nothing of children, less still of traumatized ones. All he could offer was a roof, meager food, and the absence of overt cruelty. He wondered if it would ever be enough. The prairie wind, a ceaseless mourner, keened around the corners of the cabin, a soundtrack to their silent cohabitation. Weeks bled into a month, each day a near replica of the last, measured by the sun's arc and the slow, agonizing unfurling of Ilara's tentative presence. She remained largely silent, a ghost in the periphery of Jedediah's hardscrabble existence. Yet, subtle shifts began to occur, like the first green shoots pushing through stubborn earth after a long winter. One morning, Jedediah found his patched work shirt, the one with a tear near the elbow he'd neglected to mend, laid neatly on his cot, the rip stitched with surprisingly deft, if uneven, stitches. The thread was a pale color, unraveled perhaps from the edge of her own ragged dress. He picked it up, the rough fabric softened by the unexpected care. He said nothing when Ilara emerged, her eyes still avoiding his, but he wore the shirt that day, the mended tear a small, warm spot against his skin. Later, he found her by the wilting vegetable patch, a small, sharp stone in her hand, carefully digging around a struggling carrot top, pulling away the choking weeds. She worked with a focused intensity, her small brow furrowed. He watched her for a long moment from the edge of the field, his heart giving a strange, unfamiliar lurch. It wasn't the work itself, but the intent behind it, the first unsolicited act of contribution to this barren place she now inhabited. He walked over, not too close, and knelt, pulling a stubborn thistle himself. She froze for a second, then, seeing he was merely working alongside her, resumed her task. They worked in silence, side by side, the only sounds the scrape of stone on earth and their shared breaths. He noticed the raw, chapped skin of her hands, the way she bit her lip in concentration. He felt an urge to tell her to stop, to rest, but something held him back. This work, perhaps, was her way of finding purchase in a world that had only ever taken from her. That evening, as he ladled stew thin but hot into 2 bowls, he placed hers on the table and then, deliberately, sat opposite her. Usually, she would take her bowl to the cot, or to a shadowed corner. Tonight, after a long hesitation, her eyes flickered from him to the stew, then back again. Slowly, she pulled out the other chair and Saturday. They ate in silence, the clinking of spoons against tin the loudest sound. He didn't try to force conversation, just ate his meal, aware of her presence in a way that was less a burden and more a companionship, albeit a mute one. A few days later, a coyote, driven by hunger, grew bold, its yelps and snarls echoing too close to the chicken coop in the dead of night. Jedediah grabbed his old rifle, his heart pounding, and rushed outside. He fired a shot into the air, the sound cracking through the stillness, and saw the shadow of the animal retreat into the darkness. When he turned, Ilara was standing in the cabin doorway, a silhouette against the faint firelight, her hands clenched at her sides. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the dark, were fixed on him. Not with the usual terror, he thought, but with something else. An attentiveness, perhaps even a nascent trust. He lowered the rifle. "Just a coyote," he said, his voice rough. "Chickens are safe," she didn't reply, but she didn't retreat. She stayed there, watching him, until he came back inside. He found her, one afternoon, sitting on the porch step, a piece of charcoal in her hand, sketching on a smooth piece of discarded plank. He approached quietly. She didn't startle this time, merely paused, her hand hovering over the wood. He looked down. She had drawn the outline of the mesas, stark and jagged against an empty sky. Beneath them, a tiny, solitary flower, remarkably detailed, pushed its way through a crack in the rock. It was a desolate image, yet the flower held a tenacious beauty. He said nothing, just nodded, a small acknowledgement, and went about his chores. But the image stayed with him, a glimpse into her silent world. The shared hardship of their existence began to forge an unspoken bond. When a sudden dust storm blew in, visibility dropping to mere feet, they worked together to secure the loose shutters and reinforce the door against the howling wind. She moved with a quiet efficiency, anticipating his needs, handing him tools, her small hands surprisingly strong. Trapped inside for 2 days, the cabin filled with the eerie shriek of the storm, the silence between them felt less strained, more a shared endurance. He even caught her, once, humming a faint, tuneless melody as she restacked the meager woodpile by the hearth. The sound was so fragile, so unexpected, it almost brought a lump to his throat. One evening, as the storm abated, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily still, he was mending a piece of harness by the firelight. Ilara sat on her cot, watching the flames. He felt her gaze on him, more direct than usual. He looked up. Her lips parted, as if to speak. He waited, his breath held. "Jay? Jed Edia." Her voice was a whisper, raspy from disuse, the syllables hesitant, fragile. It was the first time she had said his name. It was the first time he had heard her truly speak more than a single, reactive sound. He lowered the harness slowly. "Yes, Ilara," he replied, keeping his own voice soft, trying to match the quietness of hers. He'd learned her name from a faint etching on a tiny, tarnished metal tag he'd found caught in the seam of her wretched dress when he'd insisted she wash in the creek, offering her one of Martha's old, patched chemises. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, as if the effort was too much, she curled up on her cot, turning her face to the wall. Jedediah sat there for a long time, the piece of harness forgotten in his lap. The 2 words, so small, so quiet, resonated in the stillness of the cabin, filling the empty spaces in a way Martha's laughter once had. It wasn't laughter, no. It was something far more delicate, more precious. It was the sound of a seed, long buried in frozen ground, finally breaking through. The need for supplies eventually became undeniable. The flour sack was nearly empty, the salt gone, and coffee, a luxury Jedediah had foregone for months, now felt like a necessity to cut through the perpetual weariness. He couldn't put off a trip to Prairie Bend any longer. The town was a good half-day's ride, a small, dusty collection of false-fronted buildings huddled around a muddy main street, its inhabitants bound by proximity and a shared suspicion of outsiders. He debated leaving Ilara at the farm. The thought of her alone, vulnerable, even for a day, settled uneasily in his gut. But the alternative, taking her into the lion's den of public scrutiny, felt almost as perilous. She was still so fragile, her newfound voice barely a whisper. In the end, the fear of leaving her unprotected outweighed the fear of exposing her. He told her the night before, his words simple. "We go to town tomorrow." For supplies, Ilara's reaction was instantaneous. The small, hesitant openness she had begun to show vanished, replaced by a familiar wariness. Her eyes widened, and she seemed to shrink into herself. He saw the tremor in her hands as she helped clear the supper dishes. He tried to reassure her. "You'll stay close to me. It'll be all right," but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Prairie Bend was not a kind place. The journey was tense. Ilara rode on the mule behind him, her small hands clutching his belt, her body rigid. She wore one of Martha's old sunbonnets, its brim pulled low, obscuring her face, a small, pathetic attempt at anonymity. Jedediah felt the weight of her fear, a palpable pressure against his back. As they approached the town, the sounds of it, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant shouting of children, the rumble of a freight wagon, seemed to amplify Ilara's distress. She pressed closer to him, her fingers digging into his sides. Main Street was busy. Farmers in from their homesteads, a few rough-looking men lounging outside the saloon, women with shopping baskets hurrying along the boardwalk, their skirts kicking up dust. Every eye, it seemed to Jedediah, turned towards them as they rode in. He felt the familiar prickle of judgment, the unspoken questions. A widower, rough-looking, with a silent, half-hidden child. He knew what they would think. He dismounted in front of Henderson's Mercantile, the largest store in town, its windows displaying a meager assortment of goods. "Stay here," he told Alara, his voice low, as he tied the mule to the hitching post. She nodded, her face still hidden by the bonnet, but he could feel her trembling. Inside, the store was cool and dim, smelling of kerosene, dried beans, and bolts of calico. Mrs. Henderson, a woman with a sharp nose and even sharper eyes, presided behind the counter. She offered Jedediah a curt nod. "Mr. Croft." Been a while, her gaze flickered towards the door, where Alara was a small, indistinct shadow. "Flour, salt, coffee," Jedediah said, getting straight to the point. As Mrs. Henderson measured out the flour, her questions began, casual, yet probing. "Quiet out your way, is it? Quiet enough just you, still?" Her eyes flickered again to the doorway. Jedediah busied himself examining a display of axe handles. For now the bell above the door jingled, and two women entered, their voices bright and carrying. They stopped short when they saw Jedediah, their conversation dying. Their eyes, too, found Alara, a fleeting, curious glance that quickly turned speculative. He could feel their whispers starting even before they moved further into the store. He paid for his goods, the coins heavy in his hand. Mrs. Henderson's gaze lingered on him, a mixture of curiosity and something he couldn't quite name, pity, perhaps, or disapproval. As he stepped back onto the boardwalk, Alara flinched as a group of boys, rowdy and loud, ran past, nearly knocking into her. One of them jeered, "Look at the scarecrow," before his companion pulled him away, laughing. Alara shrank further against the mule, her small shoulders hunched. Jedediah felt a surge of protective anger. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, reassuring pressure. "It's all right," he murmured, though his jaw was tight. He loaded the supplies onto the mule, conscious of the eyes watching them from storefronts, from behind curtained windows. The whispers followed them like flies. He saw Mrs. Periwinkle, the town's most notorious gossip, her head together with Mrs. Albright, their expressions a mixture of shock and sanctimonious condemnation. He knew the stories that would be circulating by nightfall. Jedediah Croft, that strange, solitary widower, had taken in a girl. Where did she come from? What was she to him? The unspoken accusations hung heavy in the dusty air. He wanted to shout, to defend himself, to shield Alara from their narrow, judging eyes, but he knew it would be useless. Words would only fuel the fire. His actions, his quiet life, would have to be his only defense and Alara's. As they rode out of Prairie Bend, the tension in Jedediah's shoulders slowly began to ease, but Alara remained rigid, silent. The sunbonnet still hid her face, but he imagined her eyes, wide and haunted, reflecting the suspicion and unkindness they had encountered. The town, with its prying eyes and wagging tongues, was another kind of wilderness, perhaps more dangerous than the coyotes and the storms. It was a wilderness of human hearts, quick to judge, slow to understand. He had brought Alara into his isolation, but he realized now that isolation was no longer a sanctuary. It was a spotlight, drawing the unwelcome attention of a world that did not comprehend, and therefore, condemned. The journey back to the farm was even quieter than the one to town. The weight of the town's judgment settled between them, a new, unspoken burden. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that Silas Blackwood was not the only threat they faced. The whispers had begun, and whispers, in a small town, could be as damaging as any physical blow. He looked back once, at the receding dust cloud that was Prairie Bend, a knot of apprehension tightening in his chest. He had hoped for peace, for a quiet mending. But the world, it seemed, was not yet done with them. The visit to Prairie Bend, brief as it was, left a chill that seeped into the fragile warmth beginning to grow between Jedediah and Alara. The town's unspoken accusations hung in the air of the small cabin, a reminder of an outside world that watched and judged. Alara retreated further into her shell, her voice, which had just begun to emerge, silenced once more. She moved about her small chores with a renewed skittishness, her eyes constantly darting towards the door as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. Jedediah found himself more watchful too, his senses heightened, a low thrum of anxiety accompanying his daily labor. The peace he had briefly glimpsed felt precarious, easily shattered. One evening, a few days after their trip to town, a violent thunderstorm rolled in, the kind that seemed to split the sky open. Lightning illuminated the stark landscape in blinding flashes, followed by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Rain lashed against the roof and windows, a furious, relentless drumming. Jedediah had seen many such storms, but this one felt different, its fury mirroring the turmoil within him. He sat by the hearth, staring into the flames, the rifle propped nearby, less for any real threat than for a semblance of preparedness. Elara was huddled on her cot, a small, trembling bundle under her thin blanket. With each clap of thunder, she flinched, a tiny, muffled gasp escaping her. He remembered her terror at Silas Blackwood's camp, the way she'd recoiled from sudden noises, from raised voices. This storm, in its raw, untamed violence, was likely dredging up those fears, those memories she kept locked away. He considered speaking, offering some useless reassurance, but what could he say? That the storm would pass? That she was safe? Words felt inadequate against such primal fear. Instead, he simply remained, a steadfast presence in the flickering firelight. The storm raged for hours. At one particularly violent crash of thunder, so loud it felt as if the sky were collapsing upon them, Elara let out a small, sharp cry. Not a word, but a pure sound of terror. Then, silence, broken only by her ragged breathing and the drumming rain. Jedediah waited. He heard a rustling from the cot, then soft, hesitant footsteps. He didn't turn, didn't want to startle her. He felt her approach, a small, cold presence behind him. She stopped a few feet away. He could hear her shallow, quick breaths. The dark, she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible above the storm. And the shouting he understood. Not just the storm, but what the storm represented, chaos, powerlessness, the terrifying sounds of violence she had endured. He slowly turned his head. In the dim light, he saw her face, pale and tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a deeply ingrained terror. She was clutching a small, carved wooden bird he hadn't seen before, something she must have kept hidden, a tiny talisman against the horrors of her past. He thought of Silas, his booming voice, the crack of his strap. He felt a cold fury rise within him, so potent it almost choked him. He reached out, very slowly, and gently took her small, cold hand. Her fingers were like ice. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "You're safe here, Elara," he said, his voice low and steady, trying to infuse it with a conviction he sometimes struggled to feel himself. "The storm is loud, but it can't get in. And there's no shouting here." Not anymore. He didn't know if she believed him. He wasn't sure he fully believed it himself. But he held her hand, a silent promise in the midst of the tempest. She didn't speak again, but she didn't retreat to her cot. She sank to the floor beside him, still clutching the wooden bird, her gaze fixed on the fire. They sat there together, two solitary figures against the raging storm, the silence between them filled not with fear or awkwardness, but with a shared vulnerability. He noticed a long, thin scar tracing a pale line from her temple into her hairline, previously hidden by her tangled hair. Another mark of her past, another testament to the cruelty she had survived. He wondered about the story behind that scar, behind the haunted look in her eyes, behind the little wooden bird she clung to so fiercely. He knew he might never hear those stories. Perhaps some wounds were too deep for words. But as the storm slowly began to subside, its fury spent, replaced by the steady, gentler rhythm of the rain, he felt a subtle shift in the small hand he held. Her fingers, still cold, seemed to relax slightly, her grip loosening just a fraction. It was a tiny thing, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, with the scent of wet earth filling the air, he knew something profound had passed between them. He had not offered grand pronouncements or easy comforts, only his presence, his quiet solidarity. And perhaps, in the face of overwhelming fear, that was the most powerful reassurance of all. The shared vigil through the storm seemed to break through another layer of Elara's reserve. The next morning, she pointed to a drawing she'd made on a piece of bark, a crude depiction of a dark, looming building with stick figures inside, one larger, wielding a whip. Her finger trembled as she tapped the larger figure than herself. No words, but the story was clear. Jedediah merely nodded, his jaw tight, his gaze full of a grim understanding that needed no voice. He was beginning to piece together the fragments of her suffering, and each piece hardened his resolve to protect this child who had, almost imperceptibly, begun to fill the vast, empty spaces in his life. The uneasy truce with the world beyond their small, isolated farm felt increasingly fragile. Jedediah knew, with a grim certainty, that Silas Blackwood was not a man to accept defeat or forget a perceived slight, especially one that involved what he considered his property. The sum Jedediah had paid was substantial, but Blackwood's greed was likely matched only by his cruelty and his possessiveness. He would view Ilara's absence not just as a financial loss, but as an affront to his authority. It was only a matter of time. Jedediah began to spend his evenings cleaning his rifle, checking his meager supply of ammunition. He did this quietly, methodically, after Ilara had retreated to her cot, but he knew she watched him sometimes, her small face still in the shadows, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth. He saw not fear in her gaze then, but a quiet, solemn understanding. She had lived under the shadow of violence for so long, its preparations were likely a grimly familiar ritual. One afternoon, while mending a fence at the far edge of his property, the part closest to the faint track that eventually led towards the mining territories, he saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. Even from a distance, there was an unmistakable arrogance in the way the man sat his horse, a brutish confidence that made Jedediah's hand instinctively go to the hunting knife at his belt. As the rider drew closer, his features became clear. Silas Blackwood. His obsidian eye swept over Jedediah's struggling farm with open contempt, lingering on the small, patched cabin. A cruel smirk played on his lips. He reined in his horse a few yards from where Jedediah stood, the animal restless, sensing the tension in the air. "Well, well." "Farmer Croft," Blackwood drawled, his voice carrying easily in the still air, laced with undisguised mockery. "Enjoying your acquisition?" Jedediah said nothing, merely straightened, his stance solid, his gaze steady. He didn't reach for his rifle, which leaned against a nearby fence post, but his awareness of it was acute. "I came for what's mine," Blackwood stated, his smirk fading into a harder, more menacing expression. "The girl. Ilara. Or whatever name she's hiding under now, she's not yours," Jedediah said, his voice low, even. "I paid you," Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You paid for her use, farmer. Not her ownership. She's a stray, and strays always find their way back to their master, or their master finds them." He leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes glinting. "She's more trouble than she's worth to you. Look at this place. You're barely keeping your own head above water. What can you offer a half-wild whelp like that?" "She stays here," Jedediah repeated, his voice hardening. He could feel the slow burn of anger, cold and deep, but he kept his expression impassive. He thought of Ilara, her tentative smiles, the way she was slowly, painstakingly mending not just his clothes, but the frayed edges of his own broken life. The thought of her back in this man's clutches was unbearable. From the corner of his eye, he saw a flicker of movement near the cabin. Ilara. She was standing in the doorway, small and still, watching them. Her face was pale, but there was a new expression there, something he hadn't seen before. Not just terror, but a flicker of defiance, a shadow of the resilience he knew lay buried deep within her. Blackwood saw her too. His eyes narrowed, and a truly unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Ah, there's the little sparrow. Hiding behind your skirts, is she, farmer? Doesn't matter. I'll have her back. One way or another." He spat on the ground. "Town's already talking, you know. Old man, young girl, doesn't look good. Folks around here, they got strong ideas about decency. Might be they'd think I was doing you a favor, taking her off your hands. Might even think you stole her." The threat was clear, insidious. Blackwood would use not just force, but the town's prejudice, their ignorance, as a weapon. Jedediah felt a tremor of fury, but his voice remained calm, dangerously so. "You set one foot on this land towards her, Blackwood, and it'll be the last step you take." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of absolute conviction. For a moment, surprise flickered in Blackwood's eyes, quickly replaced by a sneer. He was used to bullying, to intimidation, not to this quiet, unyielding resistance from a man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. "Big words, farmer. You think that rusty scattergun of yours scares me?" He gestured dismissively towards the rifle. "I'll be back. And I won't come alone next time." "You can count on that." With a final, contemptuous glare, Silas Blackwood wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in his wake. Jedediah watched him go, his hand still resting on the hilt of his knife. The confrontation had been inevitable, he knew, but its arrival still sent a chill through him. This was not over. It was merely a prelude. He turned towards the cabin. Elara was still in the doorway, her small figure framed against the dim interior. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on him, searching. He walked towards her, his legs feeling suddenly heavy. He stopped a few feet away. "He's gone," Jedediah said. For now, Elara nodded slowly. Then, she did something that surprised him. She stepped out onto the porch, into the harsh sunlight, and looked directly at him. "He will hurt you," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear that was not for herself, but for him. Jedediah looked at this child, this slip of a girl who had endured so much, now worrying for his safety. A fierce, protective tenderness surged through him, so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "He won't touch you, Elara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I won't let him." It was a promise, a vow made not just to her, but to himself, to the memory of Martha, to whatever shred of decency remained in this harsh, unforgiving world. He knew the cost of that promise might be high, but looking at Elara's earnest, worried face, he knew it was a cost he was willing to pay. The lines had been drawn. The enemy had shown his face. And in the quiet solitude of his failing farm, with a silent, resilient child by his side, Jedediah Croft prepared for war. The confrontation with Silas Blackwood cast a long, dark shadow over the farm. The fragile peace they had begun to cultivate was shattered, replaced by a gnawing tension, an unspoken anticipation of violence. Jedediah found himself sleeping lighter, his senses perpetually on alert, the old rifle now a constant companion, leaning against the wall by the door during the day, resting beside his bedroll at night. He moved with a quiet, grim determination, his actions deliberate, his words even more sparse than usual. He wasn't a man of violence by nature, his life had been one of toil, of coaxing life from the stubborn earth, not taking it. But the threat to Elara had awakened something primal within him, a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy wooden bar he fashioned from a piece of spare timber. He checked the rusted hinges on the shutters, oiling them, ensuring they could be secured quickly and tightly. His preparations were not frantic, but methodical, the actions of a man steeling himself for an inevitable trial. Elara watched him, her large, solemn eyes missing nothing. The terror that Blackwood's appearance had initially sparked in her slowly gave way to a quiet resolve that mirrored Jedediah's own. She didn't speak of the threat, but her actions spoke volumes. She became his shadow, her presence a constant, silent support. If he was mending a fence, she was nearby, gathering stones to shore up a loose post. If he was chopping wood, she would collect the kindling, stacking it neatly by the hearth. She seemed to understand, with an intuition born of her own harsh experiences, that they were in this together, a tiny, embattled garrison against a hostile world. One afternoon, while Jedediah was cleaning his rifle for the third time that week, meticulously wiping down the barrel, checking the firing mechanism, Elara approached him. She held out a small, intricately woven pouch made of dried grasses. Inside were several smooth, flat stones, perfect for a slingshot. She had seen him eye the rusty frame of an old one hanging in the shed. For warning," she whispered, her gaze earnest. Jedediah looked at the pouch, then at her small, determined face. A lump formed in his throat. She wasn't just a victim to be protected, she was actively seeking ways to contribute, to defend their small sanctuary. He took the pouch, the stones cool and smooth in his calloused palm. "Good," he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. "Very good." Ilara, a rare, fleeting smile touched her lips before vanishing as quickly as it came. He found the old slingshot, its leather straps rotted, and spent the evening carefully fitting new ones, Ilara watching him with quiet intensity. He showed her how to load it, how to aim, his large hands gentle as he guided hers. He didn't expect her to fight, but if she could create a distraction, give a warning, it might be enough. The shared purpose, the quiet preparations, forged a new depth in their bond. The silence between them was no longer one of fear or uncertainty, but of understanding, of a shared fate. In the evenings, after their meager supper, they would sit by the fire, Jedediah oiling the rifle, Ilara perhaps mending a tear in his shirt, or simply watching the flames. The air was thick with unspoken anxieties, yet there was also a strange sense of peace, the peace of having chosen a path, however dangerous. Sometimes, in these quiet moments, Jedediah would find himself talking, his voice low, telling her small things about the farm, about the changing seasons, about Martha. He spoke of Martha's love for wildflowers, the way she could coax herbs to grow where nothing else would. He didn't speak of his grief directly, but Ilara seemed to understand the sorrow that lay beneath his words. She would listen, her head tilted, her eyes reflecting the firelight, a silent, empathetic presence. One evening, she reached out and touched the faded quilt on Martha's bed, her fingers tracing the intricate stitching. "She made this?" Ilara asked, her voice barely a breath. Jedediah nodded. Her hands were seldom idle. She found beauty in small things. Ilara looked at him, then back at the quilt. "Like the flower," she said, referring to the drawing she had made of the solitary bloom on the mesas. Jedediah met her gaze, a profound sense of connection passing between them. Yes, he thought. Like the flower. A small, resilient thing of beauty in a harsh, unforgiving world. He knew that Blackwood's threat was not just about reclaiming Ilara. It was about power, about cruelty, about extinguishing any spark of defiance or hope. Blackwood represented the darkness they had both known, the darkness that threatened to engulf them again. But looking at Ilara, at the quiet strength that was beginning to blossom within her, Jedediah felt a flicker of something akin to hope himself. They were not strong in the way the world measured strength. They had no wealth, no allies, no army. But they had each other. And in the face of overwhelming odds, sometimes, that was all the strength one needed. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The wind carried the scent of approaching winter, and with it, a heightened sense of foreboding. Jedediah continued his quiet preparations, his resolve hardening with each passing day. He was no longer just a grieving widower, lost in his own desolation. He was a protector. He was, in a way he had never anticipated, a father. And he would defend his small, unconventional family, whatever the cost. Silas Blackwood, true to his insidious nature, did not rely solely on the threat of direct violence. He began to poison the well of public opinion in Prairie Bend, letting whispers and rumors fester like an untreated wound. Stories circulated, each more distorted than the last. Jedediah Croft, the reclusive widower, had bought a child, some said for nefarious purposes. Others whispered she was a runaway, a thief he was harboring. The truth of her rescue from Blackwood's brutal labor camp was conveniently omitted or twisted into something sinister. Jedediah became aware of the shifting sentiment during a necessary trip to town for lamp oil and salt pork, a journey he undertook alone this time, leaving Ilara hidden and secured in the cabin, a heavy weight of reluctance in his heart. The usual curt nods from acquaintances were replaced by averted gazes or openly hostile stares. Mrs. Henderson, at the Mercantile, was civil but distant, her usual probing questions replaced by a cool professionalism that felt like a wall. He overheard snippets of conversation, hushed but venomous, as he passed the saloon. "Ain't right, a man his age with a girl that young," heard Blackwood say she was stolen property, should run him out of the county. The injustice of it burned in Jedediah's chest, a bitter, helpless anger. He knew these people, or thought he did. He had shared meager harvests with some, helped raise a barn for another. Now, they looked at him as if he were a monster. He finished his business quickly, his jaw set, his eyes hard. As he was loading his supplies onto the mule, a small, stooped figure approached him. It was Elijah, the town's elderly, half-blind blacksmith, a man known more for his quiet wisdom and occasional cryptic pronouncements than for his smithing skills in recent years. His forge was mostly cold now, but his mind remained sharp. "Jedediah," Elijah said, his voice raspy, his clouded eyes seeming to look through him rather than at him. The small cluster of men outside the saloon fell silent, watching. "Heard you got company out at your place." Jedediah braced himself. "A child, Elijah." "Needed help." Elijah nodded slowly, stroking his thin, white beard. "Some say a wolf in sheep's clothing is still a wolf. Others say a drowning pup will bite the hand that saves it." Out of fear he paused, his gaze distant. "But I reckon a man's heart, even a scarred one, knows the feel of true north better than any compass. And sometimes, a small bird sings sweetest after the storm." He patted Jedediah's arm, a surprisingly firm grip for such a frail man. "Don't let the yapping of coyotes drive you from your den, son. Some storms are just noise. Others you gotta face head on." Then, as quietly as he'd appeared, Elijah turned and shuffled away, leaving Jedediah standing by his mule, the old blacksmith's words echoing in his mind. It wasn't outright support, not exactly, but it was a crack in the wall of condemnation, a sliver of understanding in a sea of prejudice. Not everyone, it seemed, was swayed by Blackwood's poison. Later that week, as Jedediah was repairing a leak in the cabin roof, a lone wagon rumbled up the track. His hand immediately went to the rifle propped against the wall. But it wasn't Blackwood. It was Martha Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, her face set in a determined, if slightly nervous, expression. Ilara, who had been helping him by handing up shingles, darted inside the cabin like a frightened rabbit at the sight of the visitor. Mrs. Henderson climbed down from the wagon, clutching a covered basket. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice a little breathless. I brought some things." She gestured to the basket. "Some fresh bread. And a bit of broth. Figured it might be welcome." Jedediah stared at her, surprised. He remembered her cool demeanor in the store, the unspoken judgment in her eyes. "Why?" he asked, his voice blunt. Mrs. Henderson flushed slightly. "Silas Blackwood was in the store yesterday. Bragging. About how he was going to reclaim his property. Said some vile things about the girl. About you." She looked towards the cabin door, her expression softening. "I remember Ilara. From when you brought her in. She looked haunted. My own youngest, Sarah, she's near that age." She paused, her gaze meeting Jedediah's. "A child ain't property, Mr. Croft. And what I saw in that girl's eyes wasn't wickedness. It was fear. Deep fear." She held out the basket. "Elijah, he sometimes talks sense, for all his ramblings. Said something about not judging a book by its battered cover." Jedediah slowly reached for the basket. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson." "Martha, please," she said, a small, hesitant smile touching her lips. "And the girl? Ilara. Tell her some folks in town ain't listening to Blackwood's lies." She climbed back into her wagon, gave a curt nod, and drove away, leaving Jedediah standing there with the unexpected gift, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the broth. The tide, perhaps, was beginning to turn. Not a flood of support, but a few brave ripples against the current of malice. He took the basket inside. Ilara peered out from the shadows, her eyes wide. He uncovered the basket, revealing the fresh bread, its aroma filling the small cabin, and a jar of still warm broth. "From Mrs. Henderson," he said. "From town." Ilara looked at the food, then at him, a question in her eyes. "She said, some folks ain't listening to Blackwood," he explained, a little awkwardly. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of hope lit Ilara's face. It was a small gesture, a basket of food, a few kind words. But in their isolated world, besieged by threats and suspicion, it felt like a lifeline. It meant they weren't entirely alone. It meant that even in the darkest corners, a little bit of light, a little bit of courage, could still shine through. The bread was the best they'd eaten in months. And as they shared it, a new, fragile sense of hope began to settle in the small cabin, a counterpoint to the ever-present threat that still loomed on the horizon. The fragile hope brought by Mrs. Henderson's visit and Elijah's cryptic encouragement was short-lived, shattered by the inevitable arrival of Silas Blackwood. He came not as a lone rider this time, but with 3 other men, hard-faced and grim, their expressions mirroring the predatory intent in their leader's eyes. They rode up to the edge of Jedediah's cleared land just as the sun began to dip below the mesas, casting long, menacing shadows that stretched towards the small cabin like grasping claws. Jedediah had been expecting them. A sixth sense, honed by a lifetime of living close to the bone and the recent, constant tension, had kept him on edge. He'd seen the dust cloud from their approach miles off, a telltale sign in the otherwise still afternoon. He'd sent Ilara to her hiding place, a small, cleverly concealed bolt hole beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin, a space she'd discovered and enlarged herself, her small hands tirelessly digging away the earth. It was cramped and dark, but it was the safest place he could offer. He stood on the porch, his old rifle held loosely in his hands, not aiming, but ready. His face was a mask of grim resolve. The 4 riders fanned out, a clear attempt to intimidate, to surround. Blackwood reined in his horse directly in front of the porch, a sneer firmly in place. "Evening, farmer," he said, his voice dripping with false bonhomie. "Come to collect what's owed." "And this time, I brought friends to help with the persuasion." His men chuckled, a harsh, mirthless sound. Jedediah's gaze swept over them, taking in their worn gun belts, their predatory stances. They were hired muscle, men who would do whatever Blackwood paid them for, without question, without conscience. "She's not here, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice calm, betraying none of the cold dread that coiled in his stomach. "And you're not welcome." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Croft. I know she's here. We saw smoke from your chimney. A cozy little nest you got." He gestured to one of his men. "Carver, you and Sykes check the barn, the shed. Make sure our little bird hasn't flown too far." The 2 men dismounted, their spurs jingling ominously as they moved towards the outbuildings. Jedediah tensed, but held his ground. He couldn't defend both the cabin and the shed. He had to trust Ilara would stay hidden. "You're trespassing, Blackwood," Jedediah said, his voice low and dangerous. "Last warning." Blackwood laughed. "Warnings? From you?" An old, broken-down sodbuster playing protector. He swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "I'm tired of this game, Croft. Give me the girl, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you keep this pathetic excuse for a farm." The 2 men returned from the shed, shaking their heads. "Nothing, boss. Place is empty as a pauper's promise." Blackwood's gaze fixed on the cabin. "Then she's in there. Sulking. Hiding. Like the little coward she is." He took a step towards the porch. Jedediah raised the rifle slightly, the movement subtle but unmistakable. "Stay back, Blackwood." For a moment, their eyes locked, a battle of wills played out in the charged silence. Blackwood's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of raw anger. He was not used to being defied. "You think you can stop me? Stop us?" He gestured to his remaining man, a burly, scar-faced individual named Pike. "Pike, encourage Mr. Croft to be a little more cooperative." Pike grinned, revealing a row of yellowed teeth, and started towards the porch, his hand reaching for his own weapon. This was it. The moment Jedediah had dreaded, had prepared for. He had no illusions about his chances against 4 armed men. But he would not yield. He would not let them reach Ilara. As Pike took another step, a small, sharp stone whizzed through the air, striking him squarely on the temple. Pike yelped, stumbling, his hand flying to his head. Another stone followed, then another, hitting Blackwood's horse on the rump, making it rear and snort in alarm. Blackwood cursed, struggling to control his mount. From the small, grimy window of the cabin, just a crack open, Ilara's small face was visible, her eyes blazing with a desperate fury. In her hand was the slingshot Jedediah had mended, her arm a blur as she reloaded and fired with surprising accuracy and speed. It was a desperate, courageous act, a child's defiance against overwhelming force. But it bought Jedediah a precious second. As Blackwood fought, his horse and pike reeled in pain. Jedediah leveled his rifle and fired. Not at Blackwood, not yet, but at the ground near Pike's feet, the shot kicking up a spray of dirt and rock. "Get off my land!" Jedediah roared, his voice raw with a fury that surprised even himself. The sound of the gunshot, the unexpected resistance from Elara, and Jedediah's sudden ferocity seemed to momentarily stun Blackwood's men. Carver and Sykes, who had started back towards the cabin, paused, their expressions uncertain. Blackwood finally wrestled his horse under control, his face contorted with rage. "You little witch," he screamed at the window, then turned his fury on Jedediah. "You'll pay for this, Croft! Both of you!" He drew his pistol. But before he could aim, another sound split the air, the unmistakable thunder of multiple hooves, approaching fast. From the track leading from town, a small group of riders emerged, indistinct at first in the fading light, then resolving into familiar figures. Elijah, the old blacksmith, surprisingly upright on a swayback mare, a rusty but formidable-looking horse pistol in his hand. Beside him, Martha Henderson, her face pale but resolute, wielding a long-barreled shotgun with an air of grim determination. And behind them, 3 other townsmen, farmers Jedediah recognized, armed with hunting rifles and expressions of stern resolve. They reined in beside Jedediah, forming a ragged but determined line. "Evening, Silas," Elijah said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Looks like you're having a bit of trouble. Misplaced something, have you?" Blackwood stared at them, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His hired guns looked uneasy, their bravado faltering in the face of this unexpected development. "This ain't your fight, old man," Blackwood snarled. "Stay out of it, reckon it is our fight," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice clear and steady, the shotgun held unwavering. "When a man bullies a child, and threatens a decent neighbor, it becomes everyone's fight." The other farmers murmured their assent, their rifles held ready. The balance had shifted. Blackwood was no longer facing a lone man and a child. He was facing a community, however small, however reluctantly gathered, that had finally decided to take a stand. He looked from Jedediah to the townsfolk, his face working with frustration and a dawning realization that he had overplayed his hand. His men were looking at him, waiting for a command, but their enthusiasm for a fight had visibly waned. With a string of curses, Blackwood holstered his pistol. "This ain't over, Croft," he spat, his voice venomous. "None of you have heard the last of this." He wheeled his horse, his men following suit, and they galloped away into the deepening twilight, their retreat far less arrogant than their arrival. Jedediah slowly lowered his rifle, his body trembling with reaction. Elara emerged from the cabin, her face smudged with dirt, the slingshot still clutched in her hand. She looked from Jedediah to the townsfolk, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, relief, and dawning wonder. The silence that followed was broken only by the chirping of crickets and the ragged breathing of those who remained. The immediate threat had passed, but the air was still thick with the residue of violence and the unspoken emotions of a confrontation that had changed everything. The departure of Silas Blackwood and his men left an echoing silence in its wake, a stillness charged with unshed tears and unspoken gratitude. Jedediah leaned heavily against the porch railing, the rifle suddenly a leaden weight in his hands. His legs felt unsteady, the adrenaline draining away, leaving behind a profound weariness. Elara crept out from behind him, her eyes, large and luminous in the twilight, fixed on the small group of townsfolk who remained mounted before the cabin. They were an unlikely cavalry, Elijah, his ancient pistol now resting on his pommel, a look of weary satisfaction on his face, Martha Henderson, her shotgun still held firmly, though her shoulders had slumped slightly with relief, and the 3 farmers, ordinary men who had found extraordinary courage. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak, her voice a little shaky but warm. "You all right, Jedediah? And the girl? Elara?" Jedediah nodded, words failing him for a moment. He looked at Elara, who was staring at Mrs. Henderson with an expression of awe. He cleared his throat. We're all right. Thanks to you all." He gestured vaguely with the rifle. Didn't expect help, Elijah chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Sometimes, Jedediah, even a stubborn town takes a while to find its conscience. Blackwood's been a burr under Prairie Bend saddle for too long. Guess some folks finally decided to pull it out. One of the farmers, a stout man named Miller, shifted in his saddle. Heard what he was planning. What he was saying about you and the child. Weren't right. Man's got a right to his peace, and a child, well, a child needs protecting. The other two murmured their agreement. Mrs. Henderson dismounted, her movements stiff, and approached the porch. She held out a hand to Elara, who flinched almost imperceptibly before looking to Jedediah. He gave a slight nod. Hesitantly, Elara reached out and placed her small, dirt-stained hand in Mrs. Henderson's. You were brave, child, Mrs. Henderson said softly, her eyes kind. That slingshot, you surprised them all. A faint blush rose on Elara's cheeks, a sight so rare it made Jedediah's heart ache. The other men dismounted, their initial awkwardness giving way to a rough, unspoken sympathy. They didn't say much, but their presence spoke volumes. They stood around the porch, not as accusers, but as witnesses, as allies. The stark reality of what could have happened, what had almost happened, hung heavy in the air. And then, the tears came. Not from Elara, not yet. She stood ramrod straight, her small hand still in Mrs. Henderson's, her face a mixture of shock and dawning relief. It was Mrs. Henderson who wept first, quiet, gulping sobs that shook her frame. She pulled Elara into a gentle hug, burying her face in the child's tangled hair. Oh, you poor dear, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You poor, brave child. Then old Elijah, his clouded eyes glistening, wiped a tear from his leathery cheek with the back of his hand. Miller, the farmer, cleared his throat loudly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Even Jedediah felt a stinging in his own eyes, a tightening in his chest so profound it almost stole his breath. It wasn't just relief. It was something more. It was the release of months, years, of pent-up grief, fear, and loneliness, not just for himself and Elara, but for the harshness of a world that could inflict such cruelty, and the unexpected, breathtaking beauty of human kindness when it finally chose to show its face. The townsfolk didn't stay long. They knew Jedediah and Elara needed time, needed peace. They offered quiet words of support, promises to keep an eye out, assurances that Blackwood wouldn't dare show his face in Prairie Bend again, not after such a public humiliation, and the clear shift in communal sentiment. As they rode away, their forms receding into the darkness, a profound quiet settled over the small farm. Jedediah and Elara stood on the porch, watching them go. The moon, nearly full, cast a silvery light over the land, softening its harsh edges, making the struggling farm seem almost serene. Elara finally let out a shuddering breath, her small body trembling. Jedediah put a hand on her shoulder. They helped, she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. They helped us, yes, Jedediah said, his own voice rough. They did. He looked down at her, at the smudges of dirt on her face, the fierce loyalty in her eyes, the slingshot still held tight in her hand. This child, who had known so much cruelty, so much abandonment, had found the courage to fight, to trust, to connect. And in doing so, she had shown him the way back to his own humanity. He led her inside the cabin. The fire had burned low, but the small space felt warmer, safer than it ever had before. He added a log to the embers, and as the flames leaped up, casting a warm glow, he saw that Elara was crying. Silent tears streamed down her face, washing away the grime and the fear, leaving behind a raw, vulnerable grief, but also a profound release. He didn't try to stop her. He simply sat with her, his presence a steady comfort, until her sobs subsided into quiet shudders. He made her some warm milk, lacing it with a precious spoonful of sugar Mrs. Henderson had tucked into her basket days ago. She drank it slowly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and emotion. When she finally curled up on her cot, the little wooden bird clutched in her hand, her breathing soon evened out into the deep sleep of the truly spent. Jedediah sat by the fire for a long time that night, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. The terror, the defiance, the unexpected courage of strangers. The tears. He thought of Martha, of the emptiness she had left behind. It was still there, a dull ache that would likely never fully disappear. But it was no longer a desolate void. It was filled now with a fierce, protective love for the child sleeping soundly nearby, and a grudging, growing faith in the possibility of goodness, even in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. The whole town hadn't cried, not literally. But something had broken in Prairie Bend that day, a dam of indifference, of fear, of prejudice. And in its place, empathy had begun to flow. For Jedediah, for Ilara, for the simple, profound truth that family could be found in the most unexpected places, forged in the crucible of shared hardship and defended with a courage born of love. He knew the scars would remain, for both of them. But as he looked at Ilara, a small, resilient flower pushing through the harshest stone, he also knew that healing had begun. And for the first time in a very long time, Jedediah Croft felt a quiet, tentative stirring of peace in his own battered heart. The dawn that followed was crisp and clear, the sky washed clean by the night's emotional storm. It brought with it not just a new day, but a new beginning.